Hi everyone and happy new year. Welcome again. Happy new year. I'm so excited to be here today. Today I want us to look at someone that is so important, when it comes to the history of African development and African progress. Most times when I think about him, I ask myself, you know, between 2011 and now in 2025, what would have been the story of Africa if this man was still alive with a big and audacious vision that he had for Africa? This is no other person than Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. Yes, may his soul rest in peace. You know, during his reign or his during his days as the leader of Libya, when he took the leadership of Libya in 19 he took over the leadership of Libya in 1969 in a bloodless coup. And between then and 2011, it's estimated that he ruled Libya for 42 years. And in these 42 years, Libya was one of the most prosperous nations in Africa. The data are out there online. You can go and verify by yourself. Under the leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, Libya saw prosperity like it had never done before in the history of Libya. But in the later part of his government, we began to hear very uncomfortable news things about Muammar Gaddafi, one of which was that he was a dictator, he was rebellious, and they even called him crazy and mad. So I'm wondering that how can a mad person, offer almost free health care, quality health care to all his citizens? How can a mad person give every married couple, newly married couple in Libya, monies to build their own apartments? How can a mad person make provision such that his citizens get access to gasoline and fuel at almost no cost? How can a mad person decide that unless every citizen of Libya has a home, he will not build a house for his family? These are the questions, you know, that I began to ask myself. Why? Why did they describe this man as a dictator? Why did they want to paint him in a very vile and cruel way? And in fact, those who did this to Gaddafi succeeded because people began to recognize Gaddafi as a dictator, a very evil and cruel leader that was only about himself. But when you look deeper, they tell you that the more you look, the less you see. But the more I looked into the life of Gaddafi, the more I see the nationalist that he was. The more I look into the life of Gaddafi, the more I saw a man that had a broad vision of prosperity, not only for Libya, but the whole of Africa. So I want us to quickly look at some of the things that, you know, Gaddafi was clamoring for in 2009 at the UN General Assembly. One of which, to me, like I already mentioned, which made a lot of sense to me, was when he talked about African nations receiving compensation from their colonial masters as a punishment for colonizing African nations and exploiting African nations. To me, that made total sense. And that alone was enough to drive the West mad. That alone was a ground for Gaddafi to have been assassinated, because how dare you tell us to come and start paying you Africans compensations the way they regard us, that we don't deserve anything good. And one of us, in the person of Muammar Gaddafi, stood up in front of the whole world and challenged, asked that all previous colonial masters should pay their, their colonized states compensation for colonizing us and for exploiting us. That alone was enough to take away Gaddafi from the surface of the earth. Because imagine what Africa would have looked like. Because Libya was colonized by Italy, and through his leadership and his doggedness, he was able to come into an agreement with the Italian government. Number one, that Italian government should be paying the Libyan government $250 million every year for a space of 20 years. Wow. Wow. And this was agreed upon, and the Italian government accepted that they were wrong for colonizing Libya. They accepted the wrong they did to Libya, for colonizing Libya, for exploiting Libya, and they agreed to pay to the tune of $250 million every year for the space of 20 years to the nation of Libya as compensation for colonizing Libya. Wow. And Gaddafi was so gracious, you know, that in his position as the president of the African Union, he wanted to replicate that in every African state, you know, for every African state to be in a position where they are receiving compensations from their previous colonizers for the exploit, the wickedness that was done to African nations. And I ask you, can you imagine what Africa would have looked like if this was a success, that we were receiving compensation from our previous colonial masters, as punishment for what they did to us in Africa? Oh my God. Oh my God. Africa would have been heaven on earth, paradise as it were. So this, is one of the things that Muammar Gaddafi stood on his feet and was pressing the West, you know, pressing the West. And he made it public, at the UN in 2009 in his speech, that this has to be made possible. And then another important point that Muammar Gaddafi made, let's go back to the agreement between Italy and Libya. One of the agreements also that it came upon then was that the Italian government was going to build a hospital, for all maimed citizens of Libya, who were involved in the Second World War. So you can imagine the heart that the man had. He had a tenderness, a true and loving care for the people of Libya and the people of Africa at large. So when you begin to look at these things and you compare it with the media, with the news from the Western media, what they told us about Gaddafi, you begin to wonder why. Why did they have to paint him so negatively? See why we Africans have to become more aware of the power that is in our hands and the power that is in the media. The West deceived Libya, and Libyans colluded with the West and killed their messiah, who was Gaddafi. Yes, I can say that Gaddafi was the messiah of Libya, but because of foolishness, ignorance, they colluded with the West, ganged up with the West against Muammar Gaddafi, and they took him out. After they took Gaddafi out, everything came crumbling down in Libya. Go to Libya now and see the mess of a nation that Libya is. Why am I bringing this Libyan and Gaddafi story to your attention? Is to let you know that a lot can change when we begin to question what the West tells us about Africans, the leadership of Africans, and what goes on in Africa.